What happens when an entire military camp goes dark, and the men who lived it are told in no uncertain terms to never speak of it again? That was the moment a routine night shift turned into a sealed memory, the kind that sits heavy in a veteran's chest and never quite lets go. The orders weren't shouted from a general's office or carved into paper. They arrived across a table in the form of 3 silent men in plain grey suits, leaning forward just long enough for everyone in the room to understand the consequence. Say anything, lose everything. My name is Luke Lammana. I have spent years talking to soldiers, scientists, and civilians about strange encounters. Tonight's account centers on Mario, a Croatian combat engineer who was on a midnight patrol at a remote training ground in August 2019. He came back shaken, not because he had been shot at, or because an explosive went off, but because the things he and his squad heard and felt that night didn't fit into the rules they knew. He was ordered to be quiet. That order, that suppression, became the real story. Mario was a pioneer by trade, trained to locate and neutralize explosive threats, used to the smell of disturbed earth and the slow, methodic work of clearing fields. The place they were operating from was a sprawling training area, Katrinik training grounds, a landscape that had been mapped for maneuvers and demining operations for years. In August, the nights were hot and the bugs relentless. Soldiers call that kind of heat heavy, because it makes every movement feel like wading through syrup. The camp itself was isolated, scattered sleeping tents, a few concrete outposts, parked armored vehicles and trailers. Radio checks were routine and boring. Routine kept men alive because routine let everyone know where to expect each other when something went wrong. He told me he remembers the boredom before everything else. It was that kind of night where you count cigarette butts, he'd say, half laughing, trying to shrug off the memory. That small human detail matters. It anchors the extraordinary to something ordinary. He was tired on a slow rotation, eyes stinging from dust and lack of sleep. The squad did routine sweeps, the kind that make you feel like you are doing something important while the clock inches toward dawn. Radios clicked with check-ins, phones buzzed with guilty messages from home. Flashlights made slices of cone-shaped light through the dark, nothing more. Then, during a scheduled check-in, something odd. A sharp, high-pitched squeal over the radio, like feedback amplified and then cut off. Mario reached to say something, and his radio went dead in his hands. A little static, a click, and silence. At first no one thought much of it. Radios do fail in the field, but then one by one the devices stopped. Flashlights died mid-sweep. Phones went black. Even vehicle electronics that should have remained powered went dead or refused to restart. The pattern was immediate and local. Devices that only moments before were humming suddenly inert. Now the simplest explanation would be an equipment failure or a storm-induced surge. That's the reason commanders and technicians reach for first. What made the moment different, Mario said, was that it wasn't just gadgets that faltered. There was sound, low and useless to language at first, a physical tone rather than a note. He described it as a voom, a word that doesn't do the sensation justice but gestures toward an experience, a pulsing, pressure-filled sound that seemed to move through the ground and air together. As it approached, the animals in the nearby scrub went quiet. Insects that had been a steady chorus halted as if cut off. Then came movement in the trees. Branches broke, not gently, but with the sharp snap of something tearing through the canopy. He felt it in his chest before he could see it. It pushed me down, Mario told me. Not wind, pressure, like someone pressing their hands on my shoulders, and the ground beneath me wanted to lift. He tried to move and couldn't. Not asleep, not paralyzed by nerves, physically unable to shift. Men around him called names, but voices were thin and distant, as if the world had turned inside out. He remembers the darkness being absolute, the kind of black that makes you aware of the shape of your own throat. The phenomenon moved toward the camp below, and as it passed, it took power with it. Lights blinked out like candles. Radios were gone. Vehicles that had idled moments before fell silent, their batteries unresponsive. He described the camp as frozen, not in air temperature, but in the way time stiffens after an unexplainable event. There are technical ways to speak about some of these observations. When electronics fail simultaneously across different systems, technicians might call it a broad-spectrum electromagnetic disruption, a term that merely names a symptom without explaining cause. An electromagnetic event can be natural, like a lightning-induced surge, or man-made, like interference from powerful transmitters. But Mario's account included physical sensations, pressure on the body, the snapping of tree branches, and a darkness so thick it altered perception that stretched beyond a neat technical label. For the men there, this wasn't a malfunction. It was an encounter. When it passed, there was quiet for a long time, the kind that hangs heavy and invites fear. Soldiers checked each other. Phones lit up again on their own, like a sleepwalking revival. Radiographs aren't done on the spot. They are hospital procedures. But what happened next wasn't clinical. It was domestic and bureaucratic at once. Trucks arrived. People in uniforms and others without them walked through the camp in a way that shifted the tone from routine to official business. Later, Mario would say that he didn't know who was in those vehicles at first. They wore the uniforms of personnel he recognized, but there were also men without insignia, their faces unreadable, carrying equipment whose purpose he couldn't name. The trucks themselves were unremarkable, flatbeds and covered vans, but the presence of personnel who did not speak to the soldiers, yet moved with authority, raised the temperature of concern in the camp. By dawn, men were being shepherded to a central point. Some check procedures occurred, rudimentary radiation scans according to Mario, a nurse with a handheld meter, a man in civilian clothes taking notes. The forest nearby presented its own evidence, treetops where the needles and small branches had been stripped clean, as if picked away by enormous hands, an invisible sculpture of broken limbs. The physical traces were not vast, but they were visible, and they confirmed that something had passed through with force. Vehicles that had been fine the night before were having trouble starting. Engines misfired. A few pieces of equipment displayed odd electrical behavior. Lights flickered when they shouldn't have, or gauges read inaccurately. For the men, these details weren't merely anomalies. They were corroboration. You would expect the next step to be a formal investigation by the chain of command. And there was an investigation, but not the kind that remained within the camp. The men were taken to a debriefing. It was supposed to be a routine accounting of events. What happened, who saw what, whether anyone was injured. The base commander sat at one end of the table, stern and contained. He asked questions, not as a prosecutor, but as someone obligated to collect facts. Then Mario described, 3 men entered. Plain suits, grey with no patches, no identifying insignia. They did not speak much. They listened. They asked no technical questions about voltages or device failures. Instead, after listening for a long time, their message was direct. You must not talk about this. The wording was blunt and contained both an explicit prohibition and an implied threat. If you do, you will risk your job and face legal consequences. That is the order the title points to, not an operational directive about how to handle unexplained aerial phenomena, but an institutional suppression of speech. These men in suits did not stand at a podium. They sat across a table and made it clear that the thing that mattered most to them was silence. Moral and practical questions arrive immediately. Why would the higher-ups care more about controlling narratives than understanding events that might have damaged equipment or endangered lives? Who were these grey-suited men? Intelligence officers, civilian contractors, representatives of some oversight body? The men didn't know, and in the military, not knowing whom to trust is itself a corrosive reality. Mario left that room with a knot in his stomach, not just from fear of what he had experienced, but from the pressure of being told to carry the memory alone. The psychological toll for witnesses in incidents like this is often as debilitating as any physical injury. Mario told me that sleep became weaponized against him. Dreams replayed the pressure, the snapping timber, the silence of radios. He began to feel watched, not in a paranoid way, he insisted, but in a careful, constrained sense, like footsteps behind glass. Friends who might have been confidants pulled away, perhaps because they sensed the risk, perhaps because they were following orders too. The military cultivates discipline, but discipline can become isolation when it is used to silence rather than protect. Mario described losing weight, losing focus at work, and a feeling of perpetual vigilance. That is the human consequence of an instruction to stay quiet. It doesn't just close mouths, it reshapes private life. It's crucial to be clear about what we know and what remains unconfirmed. The devices failed. The men felt pressure and heard an intense low sound. Trees were damaged. Unknown personnel arrived in trucks and conducted checks. At a table, 3 men in grey suits communicated a prohibition. Do not speak of this event or face consequences. These are the verifiable elements of the account, as Mario and several others reported them. What we cannot say is why this happened, what the grey suits represented in bureaucratic or legal terms, or whether higher authorities elsewhere knew more. Speculation beyond these points is exactly that. Speculation. But Mario's experience did not exist in perfect isolation. Years of reports around the Adriatic have described clusters of phenomena that share striking features: sudden electronic failures, localized environmental effects, and a pattern of witnesses either being discouraged from speaking or disappearing from public view. On Pag Island, a group of researchers, including Zdenko Gerbots, observed a set of stones arranged in an isosceles triangle, a geometric pattern measured and noted for its precision. Stefan Zavanaric, a geologist, later analyzed the stones under ultraviolet light and reported a phosphorescent response consistent with intense heat exposure, sustained over long timescales, evidence that something had altered those stones in the distant past. To be clear, those findings do not explain what Mario experienced in 2019. They only suggest that the Adriatic region has repeatedly registered anomalous phenomena that sometimes include electromagnetic or thermal signatures. A good investigator's instinct is to assemble pattern without forcing causal chains. Mario's night shares elements: electronics failing, physical force, environmental scars, with other regional reports. Fishermen and pilots have testified elsewhere along the coast of the Adriatic to compasses spinning, sudden patches of sea that seemed to boil, lights that moved in deliberate ways. Miro Villino, a photojournalist, chronicled fishermen's stories of glowing objects and disturbed waters. Pilots have reported electrical interference with cockpit instruments. Those reports are uneven, sometimes decades apart, and often accompanied by local folklore that makes the research messy. Yet when you line up accounts, recurring motifs appear: failure of instruments, physical impacts on the environment, and a social pattern where witnesses feel compelled or are compelled to withdraw their testimony. I want to pause here and offer one brief note for anyone new to this field. An isosceles triangle, as Zdenko and colleagues noted, is simply a geometric shape with 2 equal sides and a different base. It's a way of saying the stones were not scattered at random. They formed a configuration that suggested intentionality, or a natural process that favored symmetry. Ultraviolet phosphorescence, the observation by Stefan, means the stones glow under UV light in a way that points to chemical alteration, possible signs of heating or mineral transformation. Those are geological observations, not explanations. They provide material evidence that something left a mark. What that mark means remains open. We could offer tidy narratives: military secret weapon, extraterrestrial visitation, rare geophysical anomaly. Each hypothesis gestures at possible explanations, but none can be stated as fact given the available evidence. Responsible reporting means presenting several plausible interpretations and labeling them as such. In Mario's case, we are left with the immediate witnessed sequence of events and the institutional response that followed, a debrief that culminated in an instruction to be silent. That instruction becomes the hinge of the story because it shifts the locus from an unusual event to how institutions manage information about the unusual. That management takes many forms. In some instances, it is bureaucratic: control of reports to prevent panic or to protect operational integrity. In others, it could be a reflexive attempt to maintain national security. Whatever the motive, the practical effect is to shrink the circle of testimony. That shrinkage matters because collective observation, multiple independent witnesses and physical traces gives researchers something to test. When voices are suppressed, the evidence pool contracts, and the phenomenon becomes harder to study. It also raises ethical questions about the rights of service members to speak about experiences that might affect safety or public understanding. After his debrief, Mario was returned to his unit but not to normalcy. He found himself watching the space between people more closely. He began to pay attention to who asked what questions, how long they lingered in conversations, and the tone leaders used when they spoke of the incident. He told me that one of the hardest parts was watching other soldiers, men he had shared food and jokes with, accept the order to be quiet without asking why. Silence has a way of mimicking consent. Over time, the event itself faded in the public imagination because no one amplified it. The memory persisted in closed groups, in whispered conversations, in journals the men kept to themselves. There is another piece to this story that deserves attention. In the days after the event, vehicles carrying unidentified personnel left the camp with equipment. Mario didn't know where those trucks went. He did not claim to have followed them. He only knew the shape of the departure, speed, purpose, not casual. It suggested to him that something about the incident required secure handling, or that someone else wanted to control the narrative. Again, that is an observation, not an accusation. But the presence of outside actors, the subsequent checks, and the debrief culminating in a warning to be silent all point to a pattern. The event was treated as something best handled away from public scrutiny. A sober question emerges. Who benefits from enforced silence? The obvious answer is whoever stands to lose from disclosure, institutions that might be embarrassed, contractors whose work might be questioned, or governments that fear public panic. But this question is not one we can settle here. It is also worth asking, who suffers most from silence? The witnesses themselves often pay the price: reputational risk, loss of career opportunities if they disobey orders, and the psychological burden of carrying a secret. Mario admitted that he felt betrayed not only by the mysterious force that invaded his night, but by the sense that someone in power chose secrecy over explanation. When I asked Mario if any official report had ever been filed in public, he laughed briefly and then shook his head. "Nothing useful," he said. "Paper goes up the chain, maybe. Names are on papers. But nothing that tells families or public what happened. That absence fuels speculation and opens space for narratives that can get away from the truth. The responsible course is to document and to collect corroboration, equipment logs, independent witness statements, physical traces like tree damage, and scientific analysis of affected materials. Those are precisely the kinds of things that researchers like Zdenko and Stefan have tried to assemble in other parts of the Adriatic. Their work sometimes aligns with local witness reports, and sometimes it doesn't. The point is that independent material evidence changes an anecdote into something an investigator can probe. There is a procedural caveat to note. Military documentation of unusual events often exists, but is not always accessible. Reports can be classified, filed under operational security, or simply lost in bureaucratic processes. That reality complicates any investigative effort. It also means that when a witness like Mario speaks, the narrative that reaches us is filtered by memory, fear, and the institutional pressure to remain silent. Memory is not unreliable because people lie. It's simply shaped by context. Two men in the same place might later remember different things. The human mind is not an objective recorder. That is why triangulation matters, finding multiple sources and material evidence that can be tested independently. Even within the camp, others corroborated parts of Mario's story. He wasn't the only one to report electronics failing. Several soldiers mentioned the same voom that pushed at them, the same snapping branches, and the same sense of being physically restrained. Those shared sensory impressions matter because they move the event from a personal oddity to a communal occurrence. When multiple people in proximity describe similar physical sensations, it increases the likelihood that something real and external happened. That is what made the debrief so consequential. The witnesses agreed on the experience, yet the room felt suddenly smaller when the grey-suited men issued their warning. At this point, some listeners may be tempted to draw a line straight to the most dramatic explanations. I urge restraint. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and Mario's account, while vivid and compelling, is one part of a larger puzzle. The puzzle includes physical traces, treetops stripped, equipment behaving oddly, and regional reports that sometimes echo similar patterns. It also includes institutional behavior that prefers containment to disclosure. The responsible narrative we can construct acknowledges all of these without turning any single strand into the final answer. How did Mario try to process what he'd lived through? For him, the first instinct was to check technical explanations. He and his squad examined radios and batteries. They consulted with maintenance personnel. They compared notes on how equipment behaved before and after the incident. None of the mundane tests yielded a complete answer. That absence left a residue of unease, because for soldiers, uncertainty about hazards is itself hazardous. You can plan for known threats, but an unknown that interferes with instruments and manipulates space-time perception, or at least alters sensations in deeply personal ways, slips past preparedness. The presence of non-uniformed personnel complicates the notion that this was purely a local technical failure. Trucks came from the base and beyond, and men in civilian attire, sometimes contractors, sometimes government liaisons, appear in events that intersect with both national security and scientific curiosity. Their arrival raises procedural questions. Who authorized their presence, and under what legal framework did they operate? Those are important questions, but Mario couldn't answer them. He wasn't in the chain that authorized external teams. All he knew was the sight of those trucks rolling in at dawn and the quiet competence of the men who alighted from them. I want to make an ethical point here. The impulse to treat suppressed accounts as evidence of nefarious intent is understandable. Silence often begets suspicion. But the mere fact of silence does not prove malicious conspiracy. Bureaucracies are clumsy and prioritize different things. Operational security, chain of command, political considerations. Those priorities can lead to choices that look opaque from the soldier's perspective. At the same time, we must also acknowledge that the effect on the men, fear, isolation, and a sense of being muzzled, is real and has real consequences. Those consequences should be part of any public accounting. Let's return to Mario himself, because his humanity keeps the story grounded. He is not a sensationalist. He does not seek attention. He is a man who did a job, saw something, and was then told to forget it in public. When we sat down, he showed me marks on his hands where the cold had cracked his skin, and he spoke slowly about nights when the sky seemed watchful. He said, "I don't want trouble. I want to understand." That wish, simple and honest, drives why we follow stories like these. Not to prove a theory, but to assemble facts until a plausible explanation becomes more likely than not. There is another reason this story moves beyond the personal. It ties into a regional pattern that researchers have been tracking for years. Pug Island, for example, has been a locus of odd reports going back decades. Lights that move in formation, rings of witnesses describing similar shapes, and now researchers like Zdenko and Stefan reporting material traces. On the Italian side of the Adriatic, Miro Villino has collected fishermen's accounts of glowing objects and compass failures. Pilots have logged brief instrument anomalies over the water. These reports are not uniform. That is important. They vary in detail, quality, and timing. But when similar themes, electronic interference, environmental impact, and witness suppression, repeat across independent reports, an investigator pays attention. It is worth pausing to define a term some will hear. When a report mentions electronic interference or instruments failing, what does that mean? It means devices that normally operate within expected parameters do not. Radios that were able to contact one another moments earlier suddenly cannot. Compasses that rely on Earth's magnetic field spin inexplicably. Such failures can stem from natural geomagnetic storms, localized magnetized minerals, or powerful man-made transmissions. They can also stem from phenomena we do not fully understand. The label names the symptom, not the cause. Back at the camp, the immediate practical concerns were straightforward. Ensure men were safe, document the event, and restore operational readiness. In theory, that should have provided closure. In practice, the appearance of outside personnel and the debrief that followed ensured that, for many soldiers, closure would not come from transparency. Instead, it came in the form of an order to remain quiet. That is the human beat of this story. the moment when an institution's response becomes part of the experience itself. The order did not explain the phenomenon. It contained it. As we reached the edges of our conversation, Mario told me about the nights he now spends awake, not from fear of the sky, but from the weight of silence. "It lingers," he said. "You start to think, maybe it's better to know less." That resignation is precisely why stories like his matter. When no one outside a narrow circle hears a testimony, anomalies remain anomalies, curiosities relegated to rumor. An honest public assessment requires openness to investigate, not to sensationalize, but to test and retest claims where material evidence exists. At the time of our interview, Mario had no archive to point to that documented every movement of the trucks or every instrument that failed. What he had were memories and a handful of men who remembered similar sensations. He had the sight of the stripped treetops and the sense that something had passed through with enough force to alter living tissue. He had the debrief and the grey suits. Those are the raw materials of the story. There is a larger question that sits at the edge of these narratives. When phenomena occur that affect both civilian spaces and military operations, who gets to decide what is disclosed? The public might demand answers for safety reasons. Militaries might withhold details for operational security reasons. Scientists might want raw data to analyze. Families want reassurance. These competing demands create friction and often lead to the middle path, partial disclosure. Partial disclosure, however, can fuel rumor because gaps are fertile for speculation. I left Mario with a promise. I would try to find additional sources, technical analyses, and researchers who had looked at regional anomalies. He seemed relieved, but not fully. Relief was small and fragile. The event remained lodged in his life like a splinter. He confessed to me that he had searched online for similar reports and found fragments. A fishing community's memory of a glowing object, a pilot's log entry of compass trouble, a geologist's ultraviolet analysis of stones on an island. None of these pieces sat neatly beside his experience, but together they suggested a mosaic, an outline of possible connection without a picture inside it. That mosaic is where the investigation turns outward from the camp into the Adriatic region. Bagailan's isosceles triangle of stones, Stefan's UV readings, Mirovilino's interviews with fishermen. These are the kinds of threads an investigator can pull. Pull one and you may find a small cluster of corroborating material. Pull too hard, though, and the thread might break. This is the work of careful gathering. Field visits, scientific sampling, cross-referencing military logs where available, and interviewing witnesses with a sensitivity to the risks they face for speaking. When I left that first conversation with Mario, I knew three things with reasonable certainty. Something unusual happened during that August night at Eugen Katornik. The institutional response centered on silence, and the human cost of that silence was significant. What I did not know, and do not claim to know, was the origin of the phenomenon or the precise identity of the men in grey suits. Those remain open questions, and they are the kinds that require patient, methodical work to resolve. There was one final image Mario offered before we parted, the stripped treetops against a pale morning sky, like teeth pulled clean of roots. He said, "You could see where it had rubbed the trees. It looked deliberate, but I couldn't tell by whom or what." That phrase, "you couldn't tell by whom or what," is the precise boundary that separates an eyewitness account from an explanation. We can map the event, we can list the effects. But beyond that, we are entering hypothesis. In the next stage of this inquiry, the plan is to follow those threads outward. Contact researchers who have studied the PAG formations, review any available instrument logs from maritime pilots and fishermen, and, where possible, seek corroboration from other military personnel who were stationed nearby at the time. We will treat material evidence as primary: the trees, the stones, the UV readings. Memories will be treated as testimonies to be cross-checked, not simply accepted or rejected. This approach respects both the need for rigorous inquiry and the dignity of witnesses like Mario, who deserve to be heard without being used for sensationalism. One short request before I continue. If you follow investigative stories like this one, subscribe and hit like so these interviews and assemblies of evidence can continue. There are costs, time, travel, and often legal hurdles to pursuing these accounts. Public attention matters because it creates room for documents to surface and for conversation to stay open. For Mario, the silence remained the heaviest thing. The night had taken something from the woods, from the equipment, and perhaps from the men themselves. Whether whatever passed through that training ground in August 2019 was natural, technological, or something else entirely is not a question I can resolve today. But the fact that the men who told the story were instructed not to speak is a matter of record in his account, and that instruction shapes everything that follows. As I prepared to dig deeper into the regional pattern, into PAG, into UV analyses, into fishermen's logs and pilot reports, I kept returning to that one table, the base commander's measured questions, and the three men in grey suits who did not add to the technical conversation, but instead controlled the narrative. That moment of containment is the hinge. It turned an extraordinary event into a private memory, and possibly a suppressed report. Understanding why will require more than interviews. It will need data, courage from witnesses willing to risk consequences, and sustained attention from investigators who can hold institutions accountable without falling into speculation. The next phase of the story begins with reaching out to the people who studied the stones on Pag Island and the journalists who documented fishermen's accounts. It begins with examining ultraviolet analyses and comparing them to what Mario described. It begins with charting out a regional map of anomalies and seeing whether the points align into meaningful patterns or scatter into coincidence. It begins with respect for those who bore the night and the small but real traces left in the environment. And yet, even as we turn toward those wider threads, the image of the three men in grey suits and the words they used to shut down a room remains the hardest to shake. It is the secret the title names, the military order to stay silent, and it is the place where a private memory meets public curiosity, and where the rest of this investigation must proceed. I followed the threads outward. The first stop was Pag Island. It's easy to romanticize the place from a map, a long strip of limestone shoreline, wind-swept fields and low scrub where fishermen still mend nets by hand. On the ground, it feels more isolated, a place where small communities keep their own time and where stories of strange lights become part of local memory rather than breaking news. Zdenko Gerbots had been working there for years, not as a sensationalist but as a meticulous surveyor, mapping out stone alignments, measuring angles, taking photographs with an eye for patterns most people pass without noticing. Zdenko let me walk the lines he'd charted. He showed me an arrangement of weathered rocks that, from certain angles, formed a clean isosceles triangle, two sides of similar length, a base distinct enough that the geometry was noticeable even to a layman. He explained his methods plainly: careful placement of measuring tapes, repeated observations across seasons, and notes about soil disturbance and lichen growth. Those details matter because, in a field prone to wishful thinking, methodical process separates an observation from a myth. He told me that others had pointed out the stones before him, that locals had stories, lights seen at strange hours, fishermen who hesitated when crossing a particular stretch of water. But his contribution was to document and quantify what he could see. That documentation drew the attention of Stefan Zavanaric, a geologist whose work habitually sits at the quieter end of the anomalous report spectrum. Stefan was cautious by temperament. He would be the first to insist that stones don't speak unless you know how to read the language of minerals. Under ultraviolet light, however, Stefan told me the stones did something odd. They fluoresced in a pattern he did not expect, a phosphorescent response consistent, in his view, with a history of intense heating, conditions that, in laboratory terms, can be associated with exposure to very high temperatures over time. Stefan's tentative framing, based on mineralogical indicators, was that whatever altered the stones had left a chemical trace visible under certain wavelengths of light. He and Zdenko published notes, not proclamations. They emphasized what could be measured: geometry, mineral response, and relative dating techniques that suggested the alteration was old, possibly on the order of thousands of years. Stefan mentioned a hypothesis that made headlines in quieter circles. Thermal anomalies in the region might correspond to episodes of intense local heating some 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. That number, 12,000 years, has since circulated as a shorthand. It is important to state plainly that time frame is an interpretive estimate based on certain assumptions about mineral transformation rates. It is not a single, unambiguous timestamp. Nevertheless, it offers a geological context in which unusual thermal signatures might exist, and it intrigued me because Mario's story described local heating effects, branches stripped clean, treetops damaged, that, while on a different timescale, added to a pattern of physical traces. Miro Villino's reporting filled in another dimension. He had spent months interviewing Adriatic fishermen whose livelihoods depend on close observation of the sea. They notice currents, temperature changes, and odd reflections long before scientists get around to measuring them. Miro collected accounts, men who spoke of patches of water that seemed to boil without wind, sudden fogs that rolled in and out in minutes, and compasses that spun as if disoriented. His documentation was not a single smoking gun, but a cluster of field notes, dates, times, GPS-adjacent descriptions, and photographs where available. Pilots on regional flights corroborated instrument glitches on occasion, reporting temporary loss of reliable compass headings or radio static in zones where the weather reports were clear. These were episodic, not continuous events, but they repeated in multiple testimonies across a coastline. When I put the PAG findings, Miro's interviews, and Mario's night together, what stood out was a convergence on effects rather than a convergence on cause. Electronics failing, physical pressure felt on bodies, visible environmental scars, and a social response that favored containment. Those are motifs that cross stories. That convergence is enough, in my view, to justify careful scientific curiosity and rigorous documentation, but not enough to conclude any single origin story. I sought technical perspectives to understand what simultaneous failures of radios, phones, vehicles, and other electronics might mean. I spoke with engineers and physicists who work with electromagnetic compatibility and military communication systems. Their first instinct was to treat the event as a symptom set. Simultaneous failure across disparate systems suggests either a common external influence or an internal systemic vulnerability that happens to affect multiple nodes at once. They use terms like broad-spectrum interference and transient electromagnetic pulse as neutral descriptors. Importantly, they warned against using those terms as synonyms for a single causal narrative. Broad-spectrum interference can be caused by lightning, deliberate jamming, an equipment malfunction, or rare atmospheric phenomena. The label tells you what happened to the devices, not who or what made it happen. When I described the physical sensations Mario reported, the low pulsing tone, the pressure pressing him to the ground, the breaking of tree branches, some scientists said those could be mechanical effects associated with acoustic resonance, seismic microbursts, or pressure waves. Others pointed out that psychological and neurological effects can co-occur in extreme situations. Under conditions of mass electrical failure, human perception often narrows to basic sensory inputs. A low-frequency vibration can feel like a push, for instance, especially in the dark. The point again is caution. Multiple plausible mechanisms exist, each requiring targeted data to support or refute it. Gathering that data is the hard part. Military logs, instrument recordings, and vehicle telemetry would help, but those records are typically the kind of material that becomes harder to access when incidents touch on safety, operational security, or political sensitivity. I filed public records requests where possible and contacted the base for comment. The response was procedural and limited, offering no public report that addressed the event with any detail beyond the basic line items. An incident occurred, internal protocols were followed, and the matter was handled. That official tone is not unusual. Institutions often default to limited disclosure for operational incidents. But it left a practical gap. The documentary chain that would allow independent analysis remained thin. Where official logs were scarce, local material evidence became more important. I returned to the training ground with Zdenko and a small team to photograph and document the treetops Mario described. The trees showed patterns consistent with high-force interactions at the canopy level, twisted branches, missing crowns, and bark scarring at specific heights. Those patterns do not alone reveal the source, Storms can strip canopies, for instance, but the distribution of damage relative to the surrounding unaffected woodland suggested a localized passage rather than a widely distributed weather event. In other words, the damage bore the imprint of something that moved through a path, not a sweeping environmental change. Radiation checks were performed during the aftermath, according to Mario and corroborating soldiers. A nurse with a handheld meter took samples that indicated no acute contamination. That detail guided the investigative focus away from radioactive exposure as an immediate concern. It did not eliminate the possibility of thermal or electromagnetic interactions, but it narrowed the set of urgent health hazards that would have demanded immediate public evacuation or medical interventions. One of the recurring frustrations in these kinds of investigations is the social dynamic that follows a suppression order. The grey-suited men at the debrief changed the incentive structure for soldiers. If speaking might cost you your job, many will choose silence even if they want to be heard. That self-censorship creates a documentation problem. It also raises an ethical question about the responsibility of institutions to balance operational discretion with the psychological welfare of service members. Soldiers like Mario bear the memory and sometimes bear the results. Estranged relationships, disrupted careers, and a persistent unease that colors later decisions. I watched the human side of this again and again, faces that hesitated when certain topics surfaced, offhand remarks that trailed into silence. It is a social architecture that protects institutions, but can erode individuals. I pressed gently with Mario about the suits. He was careful because he still felt their weight. He wanted to be precise about what happened at the table. The commander asked questions, the suits listened, and then the suits spoke. The message was short, direct, and unambiguous. Do not speak publicly about the incident. The men in grey gave reasons framed in practical terms: job security, legal exposure, and they framed the prohibition as a protective directive rather than a punitive threat. That framing, whether sincere or strategic, made the instruction easier for some to accept. For others, it simply felt like coercion disguised as care. Either way, the effect was the same: a reluctance to escalate matters into wider inquiry. Outside the base, reactions were mixed. Local police filed routine incident notices about the environmental damage. Some civilians reported seeing lights that night, others had not. Fishermen on the coast told me stories of patches of sea that behaved oddly, as Miro had collected, and one retired pilot described a short, unexplained instrument failure on a routine coastal survey. None of these peripheral reports were precise enough to triangulate a single event to the hour, but together they created a regional tapestry of anecdotes that occasionally overlapped temporally with other incidents. The pattern, such as it was, suggested clusters rather than a continuous wave. That patterning is important. If anomalies accumulate in geographic nodal points, Pag Island, certain Adriatic corridors, specific training grounds, then local geology and long-term heat signatures may offer part of the explanation. If anomalies were uniformly distributed, that would point more strongly to external technology or atmospheric events. The clustering we observed favored a mixed model hypothesis. Some sites show physical traces consistent with thermal impact, others report transient electromagnetic effects, and others are primarily composed of witness testimony. Mixed models are messy. They require interdisciplinary work to distinguish coincidence from causation. A theme that recurred in conversations with scientists was the need for baseline monitoring. One engineer put it bluntly: you can't interpret anomalies well unless you have records of what normal looks like at the site. Baseline magnetometer readings, continuous spectrographic recordings, and environmental sampling before and after incidents would offer much stronger clues than memories alone. That absence of baseline data is not unique to the Adriatic. It is a common obstacle in fields where phenomena are rare, unpredictable, and politically sensitive. Where monitoring networks exist, they can catch transient events and provide objective records. Where they don't, investigators must piece together a narrative from fragments. I asked Mario whether, after the event, there had been any effort to establish monitoring, even simple instruments left in place. He said no. The base appeared to move quickly to contain the immediate operational effects and the personnel issue. But no independent scientific instrument array was established on the site he described. That lack of follow-through underlines an organizational decision about where to spend resources and which incidents merit long-term study. It also shapes what future researchers will be able to find. Throughout the investigation, I kept returning to a single operationally banal but morally resonant question. Why silence? Institutions will sometimes limit communication to prevent panic or to protect methods and assets. Those are legitimate concerns. Yet the bluntness of the instruction Mario received, do not speak or face job loss and legal trouble, felt like more than routine caution. It functioned as containment of whistleblowing in the absence of transparent inquiry. I do not claim malice. I only claim that secrecy, by its nature, shifts the burden of proof onto those who seek disclosure. It is then irresistible for speculation to flourish in the gaps. The responsible path, by contrast, is to create mechanisms for safe disclosure and methodical investigation that protect both security and truth-seeking. As part of the follow-up, I reached out to veterans groups and to military ombudsmen in the region to ask about complaint pathways and protections for service members who witness unusual events. Response varied and often leaned on internal grievance procedures rather than public disclosure. Those channels can be effective for certain operational matters, but they are less effective when the issue involves broader public safety questions or interdisciplinary scientific curiosity. The upshot for individuals like Mario is a constrained route for airing concerns. One evening, far from the official rhetoric, I sat with Mario and a small group of other soldiers in a dim kitchen where the heating was still warming up after the long August night. They traded stories in low voices, more for mutual relief than to seek facts. Someone joked to break a tension no one wanted to name. Then, from the middle of a tired conversation, a young corporal asked the question that often gets buried. If something like that happens again, what do we do? The room fell quiet. For a few minutes, those men considered the tools at their disposal: training, chain of command, and the instinct to protect one another. The practical answer was incomplete and unsatisfying. Follow procedure, report up, but be mindful of orders. That grey area is where officials and ethics meet. It is also where the human cost of suppression becomes palpably practical. For a soldier on patrol, silence can feel like an order to carry risk alone. I am careful not to romanticize whistleblowing or to depict those who comply with orders as moral failures. Military discipline exists for reasons: cohesion, operational clarity, and safety under stress. But there is also an ethical architecture that needs to allow for credible reporting and for the protection of witnesses who can provide evidence for public interest matters. The tension between these poles, security and transparency, runs through every incident of this sort. Returning from fieldwork, the investigatory puzzle remained partially assembled. Material traces existed: stripped treetops, an isosceles arrangement of stones on PAG with UV reactive signatures, fishermen and pilots reporting temporary instrument anomalies, and a credible eyewitness account of an event that disrupted electronics and produced a physical sensation of pressure. Each of those pieces is valuable. None of them, in isolation, solved the question of origin. I asked experts to weigh in on the plausible categories of explanation. They offered a shortlist, each attached with cautionary qualifiers: localized geophysical events, perhaps linked to rare thermal or mineral processes, could explain chemical alteration of stones, and localized environmental damage. Electromagnetic phenomena, whether natural or artificial, could explain simultaneous electronic failures. Atmospheric acoustic or pressure waves might account for the sensation of physical pushing. Each category overlaps with others. None alone fit every observed detail. That messy overlap is the honest result of methodical inquiry when data is thin. There are inevitably voices who will prefer a single dramatic explanation. Some will favor advanced technology, military or otherwise, applied in secret. Others will reach for the extraterrestrial as a neat resolution. Both are plausible in popular imagination, but neither becomes scientific fact without corroboration. Responsible investigation keeps hypotheses on the table while emphasizing that they remain provisional. In this case, the most defensible claim is narrow. An unexplained event occurred. It produced consistent effects across several modalities. It was followed by an institutional directive to remain silent. And that directive has real human consequences. I closed my work with Mario, and those researchers not with a definitive answer but with a plan. Monitoring needs to be expanded in the area, and independent scientists should have access to sites where physical traces remain. Military institutions hold records that are relevant and ought to be consultable by authorized analysts under appropriate protections. Witnesses deserve confidential channels for reporting that do not automatically penalize their careers. These are procedural steps that do not resolve the phenomenon itself, but can sharpen our ability to test hypotheses. On a human level, I wanted to make sure Mario felt heard, not used. He had not asked for fame. He asked for understanding. That is why the central moment, 3 grey suits at a table telling soldiers to stay quiet, resonates. That order turned a shared, disturbing night into a sealed memory and placed an institutional thumb on a potentially important set of data points. Whether that thumb was intended to protect lives, contain embarrassment, or preserve secrets I could not prove. What I could show was the effect: silence that isolates, memories that hunger for corroboration, and material evidence that invites analysis. I want to leave one clear point for listeners. The phrase "military secrets exposed" in the title is meant to direct attention to a procedural moment, not to announce a global conspiracy. The exposure here is a narrow one, an institutional act that suppressed testimony about an event with physical and psychological consequences. That act deserves scrutiny because it shapes what we can know. Asking why is not the same as accusing. It is an invitation to transparency, to methodical data gathering, and to respect for those who bear witness. The Adriatic region, from Pag Island's weathered stones to the training grounds where Mario stood in the dark, is a place where material traces and witness reports intersect. Those intersections warrant further study. They deserve instruments, field teams, and the kind of patient work that turns clustered anomalies into testable insights. Until such work is done, the best we can do is assemble evidence responsibly, protect witnesses, and resist rushing to dramatic conclusions. For Mario, the nights remain uneven. The memory of pressure and the echo of snapped branches come back with a clarity that time does not entirely erode. The 3 grey-suited men at the debrief table remain a symbol, not of explanation, but of a choice about how that night would be handled. Soldiers like him are left to carry the memory and to decide, or be forced, to carry it alone. If there is one practical takeaway from following these threads, it is this: anomalies that intersect military operations demand a measured public response, one that balances security with openness, and that treats witnesses with dignity. That balance is hard. It requires structures that allow for safe reporting and for scientific analysis without immediate exposure that might risk sensitive capabilities. Such structures do not absolve institutions of scrutiny. They create a pathway for truth that both maintains necessary protections and enables investigation. My work is not finished. There are more interviews to conduct, more logs to request, and more material analyses to compare. For now, we present what we can: Mario's account, corroborating sensory reports from others, physical traces in the environment, and the documented moment of suppression at the debrief. Those are the facts we can lay on the table. The rest is an open field, an invitation to study, to test, and to listen. If this story mattered to you, consider supporting independent investigations that can follow these threads further. Join the channel or our membership to get extended research and updates as the inquiry continues. For now, the night remains lodged in memory and in those stripped treetops on a Croatian training ground. An encounter that altered more than devices. It altered the lives of the men who were there and the questions we still need answered.